Hey, what's up? Dave with Brazos Valley Strength. And today we're going to be talking about how to program and apply concepts around hypertrophy training in the context of powerlifting. So I think I have a few disclosures, I guess, to start off this video. And the first one is that I don't consider myself an expert here. I think that there's a lot better sources of information if you actually want some of the real information, the people who are actually conducting this research and interpreting the research. That's not me. This is my version, my presentation around how I think that is the best way for us to apply this as powerlifters. If you want to go to the sources, Chris Beardsley is going to be probably the main one that I'm going to be using a lot of his slides, his infographics in this, but I have a lot of others down in the description of this video. I'd highly encourage you to check those out. This is going to be a very basic, I think, approach to things, and there's a lot of complexity here. And so this video is meant to hopefully provide a framework that most people can apply to improve their training for hypertrophy in the context of powerlifting very, very quickly. So there's a lot of other ways in which we can approach this, and there's questions, and there's going to be things that probably contradict some of the things that I say, and that's okay. If you want a big picture, check out those resources below. The guys from Data Driven Strength, I think, are also some of the best resources on this as well. I have an old video that I still think is one of the best conversations around strength and hypertrophy training. I'll put that up here as well as in the description. So that's like a podcast, I guess, from my old channel. And I think it was still very, very well done within the context of strength and hypertrophy, velocity loss, fatigue, all that kind of stuff. I still send that to clients all the time, and I think it's a very, very useful video that I think really helps people understand all of those topics. So within the context of powerlifting here, we do need to build muscle over the long run in order to get stronger, right? Just having the ability to produce force is going to be dramatically improved by having larger muscles. I think that that's a concept that people can pretty easily accept, but how do we actually go about doing that without interrupting our powerlifting training? And how do we make it to where it's actually going to be productive and we're not going to waste our time, and then we're not going to limit our ability to actually continue to improve our competition lifts while we're doing it? So I think the first concept that we really have to understand is that mechanical tension is going to be the primary, and according to Chris Beardsley, maybe the only driver of hypertrophy in the first place. And I think that this is going to be an area that I think a lot of people will initially take pause with, that I think people have heard very often. And I think this was kind of the way that I was taught this coming up, is that volume is probably the main driver of hypertrophy. And I think that somewhat that's true, in that we can see in the research, and I'll hopefully have some good slides. Feel free to pause and take screenshots or whatever, or go to Chris Beardsley stuff. I got all of this from him. We can see that more volume over time and within sessions does get us more hypertrophy, but at the cost of fatigue. And that the starting point has to be getting those muscle fibers to actually contract fully as much as we possibly can. And so our external load, creating mechanical tension inside the muscles, is our first place that we have to start. And I'm going to come back and touch on some ways in which I think that this is messed up most of the time. But I think that we have to take a look at the concepts to really start off with. So mechanical tension, you can just think of the actual force of contraction of the muscles themselves. So a way to compare this would be mechanical tension versus the actual activation of the muscle itself. And I think that this is probably one of the main areas that people can get confused at times, that we can see some of the research and the EMG research on how the muscles are actually being activated by a certain exercise, and that those two things are not always the same thing. So something like a jump has very, very high levels of muscle activation, but there's not enough mechanical tension in that to actually produce hypertrophy. So you're not going to be able to reach actual failure at the end of those sets and stimulate all of the muscles within that and actually have those muscles grow from that. So the simplest way to view this is not going to be our sets times weight times reps that we're doing, but probably an easier way to do this is actually going to be looking looking at sets taken to failure, because that is how we're actually getting the most stimulating reps. So I think this is a moment that we probably do need to slow down a little bit and try to understand all of the factors that are overlapping here in this moment. That us going closer to failure is going to stimulate more hypertrophy. It's going to produce more mechanical tension from all of the motor units inside the muscle. That's like the core concept. But it also does have more fatigue associated with it. And that alone, I think, is the fatigue, the balance between fatigue and stimulus is everything that we're trying to balance here. So going to failure, I think pretty unequivocally, does have more fatigue associated with it. But at the same time, we're going to get significantly more returns. So according to the research, we can train further away from failure, but we have to do significantly more sets in order to actually get that same return. And I have an older video on why to do singles. And in that video, I lay out how our perception of effort and duration of effort have significant impacts on our fatigue that we get from sessions. And that many times people think that singles are more fatiguing than higher rep work. And it's not true, especially when we're having to factor in the actual return that we're getting from a lot of that stuff. So if in my approach to hypertrophy training, I decide that I want to do some high rep work because it's going to be lower fatigue, and that I'm not taking it to failure. I'm doing 3 sets, 4 sets of 10 to 12, and they're all fairly far away from failure. There may not be a huge amount of fatigue from those, kind of dependent on how hard that we're going, but we're also not getting a whole lot of return. And so I think that alone is probably a pretty good example of what people would consider junk volume, that we're doing reps, we're doing overall work that probably is fatiguing, but without a high return associated with it. And I just think that that's absolutely wasted time, that we could find a way to get better returns on what we're doing and still manage that fatigue appropriately. Also, according to the research though, if we're doing those higher volumes and higher rep counts, particularly higher rep counts is a vague terminology here. I think lots of times, according to the research, it's probably like 20 plus reps is probably high reps that are going to be much, much more fatiguing. Generally speaking, I think if I'm saying lower rep counts, I think like 5 to 10 is kind of the hypertrophy range that we're thinking about rep counts here. So higher rep counts, I think practically for most people, maybe like 15 to 20, maybe 30. But if we're training in some of those higher rep counts, we'll say 12 to 20 or so in this case, and actually going to failure with a high number of sets, even though the weight is light, that is going to be significantly more fatiguing than lower rep counts. And I think this is mostly demonstrated through velocity loss in the sets. And how we can I think just visualize velocity loss is that your first rep of the set compared to your last rep of the set is going to be significantly slower. And that alone is going to be coming from central nervous system fatigue within that set. So if we're doing a higher set count, there's going to be a humongous amount of velocity loss, and that's fatigue. If we're doing a lower rep count, let's say we're doing like a set of 5 or something going all the way to failure, that first rep, especially if we're trying as hard as we should, is going to be relatively slow in the first place. And so that velocity loss is not going to be all that high. We still reach failure. Many of those reps, especially the last 5 of those sets, are going to be very, very stimulating in both of them. But I declined a whole lot more in my ability to actually produce force in the set with higher rep count. And so even though the actual hypertrophy at the end of the day, because I did a similar amount of stimulating reps, is probably fairly similar, the higher rep counts in those sets are probably going to be more fatiguing for people. And so that's kind of the cornerstone of the concept that I want to look at here, and how to appropriately actually train in a way that does build muscle while balancing the lifts for powerlifting. So I think the main point is going to be that fatigue is going to be unavoidable to some degree, that we're always going to have some cost associated with our return. And if we're doing this appropriately, we should have high return while lower cost, there's going to be some cost. But if we're doing higher reps, we have to be going to failure still to be able to still stimulate those muscles appropriately, but that there's going to be much more fatigue associated with that. And the worst version is just doing high reps that are fairly far away from failure, may still feel hard, but it's fairly far away from failure, to where we're getting much higher fatigue, but much lower return on that. So that's the worst case that we could really have here. So one of the other concepts within this is that every set that we do is going to be less stimulating than the set before it. So even though we're looking at doing more volume to get more work, that doesn't always mean that more is better. And there's going to be a sharp drop off. And I think some of these graphs illustrate it really well, to where if we're training a certain muscle group, that us doing our first set is going to have the highest return on hypertrophy. That doesn't mean we get absolute full return at that point, but that set gives us from 0 to an okay amount. And then every set that we do after that gives us a little bit less than the one before it. So for us to balance this for our hypertrophy training with powerlifting, I think pretty clearly the best approach is to take fairly high loads that we can do probably in that 5 to 10-ish rep range, train them very hard, get them relatively close to failure, trying very, very hard. We can do significantly fewer sets and still have a very high return with a lot less fatigue within our training. And that's the cornerstone. That is the concept that we really have to understand. But as far as our actual execution of this stuff, there's huge, huge failures in the way that people go about this. That from what I've seen with many powerlifters in gyms, people I coach, it's still something I battle with every single day. People do not try nearly hard enough. And I think that's one of the reasons why people gravitate more towards some of the higher rep sets, is that it's a little bit more approachable. There's not as much anxiety if you're going to do a set of, tricep pushdowns of 15 reps or something like that, versus like a hack squat that we're saying, I want you to do 8 reps at a 9 RPE. And I'm genuinely saying your last rep, you should only be able to do one more, and it should be some of the most grueling work you've ever done in your life. And that's where people, I think, are failing. That people are finding ways around the real work, that they feel like they're working, but they're really not. And so going back to the mechanical tension and how to quantify volume in the first place, this is going to be one of the big challenges and one of the main places that I think the average person is doing a very, very bad job. So if we can compare 2 different ways to execute a lat pull down, I think is a good example. In one way, the better way, we're going to limit upper body movement from our trunk, from everything else. We're going to be very stable, and we're going to do our best to maintain tension on the muscle through the entire movement while trying our absolute hardest with the load that's on the bar, right? So we shouldn't just be deliberately slowing down, especially through the concentric. Slow eccentrics are okay, they're good, they're encouraged. But through the concentric, I should pretty much always be forced to try as hard as I possibly can. For one, because the load is heavy enough that I have to. And 2, moving the weight with full intent does stimulate more muscle. So both of those 2 things together while maintaining the original intention of the movement itself and staying on that muscle. That probably is very, very stimulating for every single rep that I do. The other side of it is taking probably a heavier weight and using a lot of momentum. Now, within the muscle itself, we can look at the external load on the muscle or external load on the machine, and then I use momentum. All that momentum is doing is reducing the internal forces. The mechanical tension is being reduced inside of the muscle itself. So we're literally just adding extra work. And again, one of the main ways in which we get fatigue is our perception of effort. We're increasing perception of effort while decreasing mechanical tension. That's about as bad of a trade-off as we could possibly have. If we want to be using high loads, it should be exactly expressly with the intent of very high mechanical tension. And doing anything outside of that takes away mechanical tension from the muscle and just adds it to the system, just for effort is a very, very bad thing. So when you're approaching the hypertrophy exercises, you probably should be going in expecting some level of anxiety and expecting to have to work your hardest that you possibly can to really challenge that muscle. And I think some of the failures here in the first place is people not really having a great understanding of like what the muscles do. And that's outside of, I think, the capacity of this video. But if you're doing rows and you're really flexing your upper back and you're swinging it a whole lot and your shoulders are really getting dumped forward and elevated and all of this stuff and you're not getting any retraction in your shoulders, then you're not really stimulating stuff in your upper back all that well. So diving in, taking a look at how to apply force to the muscles in the first place is also very important with this. But just simply don't use momentum, try as hard as you possibly can, and work through that whole range of motion for control and very, very high effort. But I do think it's definitely worth talking about here that I think the majority of you are very, very bad at rating your own perception of effort here. And this is something that is trainable. I think it's absolutely trainable for people to understand that they can work significantly harder than they think they can. So one of the things I wanted to bring up is facial grimace. Facial grimace just are expressions that we make when we're lifting. Is actually a pretty reliable indicator of effort. And so when I get videos that are sent to me of clients that are doing their accessory work and they're able to bang out, they're doing belt squats or whatever, and they can bang out 10 reps straight, right? And they may make some effort on like the last two or so, some facial expression on the last two or so. So we see some effort. It's clear to me they're just not trying all that hard, right? They feel like they worked hard, but my expectation of effort, and I think the clinical research, the clinical expectation of effort is there's a huge gap in what people think that they're willing to do or that they're able to do and what's actually expected. People need to work significantly harder. And so I think in many of the videos I've probably already shown and I'm showing right now, you can see even from rep number 1 on the majority of my sets, I have a good amount of facial grimace. I'm trying as hard as I possibly can from rep 1. And even like the eccentric control is not something that I feel like I'm deliberately going slow with, but the load is heavy enough and my effort is high enough that I'm forced to be working hard through the eccentric. And I'm not able to really have a lot of high paced movement during those because I'm working so hard. So if you're somebody that you're watching yourself do your accessories and you don't see yourself making some pretty goofy faces fairly early in the set, you're not trying that hard. And it's really as simple as that you should be trying the hardest that you possibly can the entire set. And that can be learned. It's a skill that can be learned for you to be able to train a whole lot harder. And I think that it definitely takes you checking yourself and checking your own ability to work harder in those moments. But I do think that that's a skill that very much can transfer over into the rest of your powerlifting. That your ability to work that hard within sessions, within sets, can very, very much be improved. I think people are very willing to, grind out a 1 rep max on bench press or something like that, but really working hard on even like a very heavy set of like lat pull downs or the much harder versions of things are the lower body accessories. These are things that people just don't challenge themselves in the way that they truly need to. And I think within that, it's at least worth bringing up that some exercises do have much more return on them, something like a hack squat or whatever, but they also do have higher requirements from our effort. So something like a lat pull down or most of the time upper body exercises, our total perception of effort is going to be lower. Right. And that's like the whole concept here originally, like we reach failure when our perception of effort reaches the most it possibly can. Lower body accessories are going to be brutal. And you just have to accept it, that lower body accessories are going to have a fairly high fatigue cost with them if we're doing them well. But for you to appropriately grow your legs, your quads, it's going to take you digging very, very deep. Like it's so uncommon for me to see people working hard enough on leg press, hack squats, belt squats, whatever, because they're very, very tough. It's hard to do. And I think that alone, the people's willingness to work hard in those moments is a big deal for what's holding people back. And so every time you do it, every session that you do it, there's probably going to be a good bit of anxiety around the way that you're approaching it. And if you're doing it hard enough, all of those sets, all of those reps that you do should be a little bit intimidating. And I just don't think that people go there. So that's probably the main message. If you're a client, that's my main message for you is I need you to try harder from rep number 1. I need you to challenge yourself. I need some pain and some suffering in there. And then we're going to get significantly more returns. And along with that, you should get more progress, and your fatigue that's associated with that should be lower for doing this appropriately. You should be able to get more returns with fewer sets if you're willing to make all of those sets as hard as you possibly can. Now, exercise selection is a big deal here. That we need high effort. We absolutely need high effort, but we need that effort to be actually transferred into the muscle to actually create mechanical tension. We're going to reach failure when our perception of effort is the highest it can be. There's many exercises that become very poor tools for hypertrophy. A back squat is probably not a great tool for hypertrophy because the stability demands the effort of it. If I'm doing high bar squats, low bar squats, whatever, if I'm actually trying to get to failure, it's going to take an incredibly high amount of total effort in order to get my quads stimulated enough to actually reach failure within my quads specifically. That it's nearly impossible to do. If you've ever done an actual 10 rep max back squat or 15 rep max or whatever, it's the hardest thing that you could imagine. And likely in those moments, we're not actually reaching mechanical failure of the quads. We're reaching our maximum perception of effort just totally with just my body, my own ability to continue to work hard there. So us choosing exercises that hopefully have lower perception of effort, meaning they're comfortable. An exercise that's comfortable and stable is going to be very, very good. So something like, pendulum squats are a popular one, hack squats, leg press. Those are all comfortable ones enough for the lower body, but that we can apply all of that stimulus into our lower body. It's still challenging. But another thing that we can do to hopefully decrease our perception of effort is that we can actually use unilateral exercises. So there's a concept within the hypertrophy training here that's called the bilateral deficit. And essentially what the bilateral deficit is that according to the research, when an exercise is stable enough, we're able to perform more reps at more than 50% of our weight, or I guess maybe we can match reps. Anyway, we can do more work at more than 50% of that max of the bilateral version of it. So a leg extension, let's say I can do a bilateral leg extension with 100 units. I could do more than 50 units with one leg. Now, the reason being here goes back to perception of effort. That global perception of effort very much influences our ability to produce force. So if I reduce the total load of the exercise, but make it harder in the muscle that I'm trying to work, I'm able to do more work. So there's many exercises that can fit this, like single arm rows and things like that, as long as stability is not compromised. So if your stability is compromised going to one arm, I think that that's a bad version. Lots of times we see this in things like some of the lat pull down exercises where I think people are very much leaning into the muscle activation or what they feel in the muscle and not nearly enough in the mechanical tension aspect. So as long as we can be stable and work very, very hard, those single arm exercises become very, very good tools for us. So this does for sure factor in with exercise selection and where you put your feet on machines and how you grip it and everything like that. Us being able to be comfortable while still producing force makes a big, big difference. So While I'm also saying we need to be able to challenge that and work as hard as we possibly can, we also need to be able to balance things that are just unnecessarily hard for kind of no reason at all. And if we find ways that we can reduce our perception of effort while improving stimulation of those muscles, absolutely, I'm all for it. Those are choices that we should be making. And as a last thought here, I did want to talk about the competition lifts just briefly because many of the things that I said here are almost the opposite within the actual power lifts when we're trying to get stronger. Proximity to failure is a very, very good tool for hypertrophy. It's kind of the tool for hypertrophy. For our competition lifts, it's kind of the opposite, that we don't want velocity loss. We want to be able to produce as much force as we can on every single rep. And what I said earlier was that especially with higher rep counts, the closer that we get to failure, we're getting velocity loss. And what's happening with that velocity loss is that our muscles are not contracting to the same degree. We're literally changing the dynamics of our ability to produce force. That's literally skill within the powerlifting, within our power lifts. And that is something that generally speaking should very much be avoided. So if you're hearing most of this video and you're saying like, oh, I want to use my bench press for hypertrophy and I'm going to go to failure. Bench press may be an okay tool for hypertrophy. Doing back squats, right? Very close to failure. I'm going to do sets of 8 at an 8 or 9 RPE. That's kind of the opposite of what we really want to be doing because of the relationship between fatigue or the maximal stimulation of the muscle itself and the fatigue that we're getting. So some exercises, bench press may be closer to it, whereas squats or deadlifts may be much further on the other side of the spectrum to where I just can't stimulate the muscle enough. And that high velocity loss is probably going to be a bad thing for actually being able to produce force effectively and maximal force when I actually need it. So overall, I know this is a pretty complex subject here. And the way that I laid it out, hopefully, is a relatively simple approach. Generally speaking, we want to train in that 5 to 10-ish rep range, hopefully getting pretty close to failure at 1 to 2 reps, sometimes getting all the way to failure. And I think you really need to challenge your own view of how hard that you can approach things in the first place. Just make it so that every session you're trying your hardest to work harder than the one before. And I think that will get you going in the right direction here overall. So if you do have any questions, let me know in the comments. I would absolutely encourage you to check out the resources that I have listed in the bio. Chris Beardsley, Data Driven Strength. Those are kind of the main ones. I think that those are better resources than I am on this subject, but this would be the way that I would approach it. If you want to look at my programs, I do have those online, and you can kind of see the way that I approach these things. Generally speaking, more advanced lifters need to do less sets than less advanced lifters. So if you're further in your powerlifting career, you may be closer to the way that I'm approaching things. If you're younger in your career, maybe you add a few more sets here and there, still make them pretty hard. So if you did like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.